Monday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and the brother on the keyboards that keeps me sane and keeps me on time and keeps me rolling and keeps the show funded and gets it up on the YouTube and the World Wide Web, Mike Ryan, engineer, leader par excellence, generation millennial. And as they say, he is one of the things that, as I said, has taken this old 26-year-old show, pulled it from analog into the digital world. So, Mike, shout out to you and thank you for all that you do to help us document the movement, a movement that's within the environmental movement that is, as I say, what I call, it puts the point on the pencil or the point on the needle, which is the environmental justice movement. And to that end, I have a brother that I've known for well over 3 decades, brother Darryl Malek-Wiley from out of New Orleans, Louisiana. We were part of the national, in fact, pioneers in what would become the national environmental and international environmental justice movement. But we go back when it was called the People of Color Summit. Brother Darryl Malek-Wiley, welcome to News, Views, and Interviews, brother, and let's wrap.
Hey, Aaron, great to see you again. Glad to be here and talking.
Brother, it is just an honor. And again, we take for granted the work that we do because we're living in the moment and the action. We're not thinking about history and posterity, but we were thinking about something called protection and justice. We are frontline communities, and whether you're poor white, poor black, communities that corporations have written off or called the externality, things that they don't have to factor into their business models and business practices, but we get to live downwind, downwater, upwind, crosswater, or if the train jumps the track, it's in our backyards. And
Yes.
So, brother, we go way back, man. I'm sitting here. I just think of moments and days, and of us out in the field. So, brother Darryl Malek-Wiley, why don't you tell us where you're at and how you came into this movement? Now, begin at your point, as they say, from back in 1972, right, with the Sierra Club, and bring us forward a little bit.
Yeah. So, in 1972, I was a junior in college, and I saw a sign at the college that there's going to be a presentation about wetlands. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. So let me go listen to what they got. And so it was a Sierra Club meeting. I went to the next one, and then somebody said, well, we need a volunteer to do this. I don't remember what it was.
All right.
But I said, I could do that. I'm relatively intelligent. And then, then they said, oh, you're doing great at that. Why don't you be a conservation chair? I said, well, and then why don't you be a group chair?
All right.
And then why don't you be a chapter delegate?
Well, then it got crazy, right? Because then the Earth Day movement came. Was it 1970? What?
Yeah, 72. It was right around that time.
Yeah.
So, and so I was organized in Wilmington, North Carolina at that time.
All right.
Right on the coast, and so worked on coastal issues. We protected a whole barrier island from development. Got it turned into state refuge. And then I got a call from one of our Sierra Club Sierra Club members in South Carolina.
Right.
Because I started working on nuclear power plants.
Okay.
And it was a bad idea then. It's a bad idea now. It just doesn't make sense. And what had happened, a citizen group had formed, fought the power plant, and got it to put in cooling towers on the plant. Because what they were going to do was going to suck all the water out of the Cape Fear River and then discharge it into the Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, boy.
And they figured it was going to kill all the fish larvae. So the group fought them, got a consent decree that said, you will build cooling towers.
Okay. Now, what's critical for people to understand is that when nuclear power plants, people call it clean energy, they have clean emissions, but they're not clean energy. So they use toxic radioactive, which stays around for hundreds of thousands of years. The byproduct and waste stays around even hundreds of thousands of years. But to cool this stuff, to keep the reactor rods cool, they got to pump in water. It gets contaminated, and it also gets superheated. So cool rivers and cool streams that are anywhere from 62 to 67 degrees can all of a sudden bump up to 75 to 80 degrees, which kills the fish. And so just wanted to lay out, because a lot of folks don't understand the process. They go, well, they're just discharging into the river. Well, no, they're discharging radioactive and superheated water into the river. which all alters that ecosystem. And for the South, by the way, as you know, if you're down south, one of the biggest things down there is fishing. In fact, Bass Pro Shops are all born out of the South. So how are you going to go into the bayous and the backwaters of the South and superheat the fish, or say pre-cook them?
Yeah, it's not a real good thing. So, so I sat in for a month hearing that EPA had, and I had a real easy position. I said, Carolina Power and Light, you signed this document, build the cooling towers. They said, well, we got all these studies. I said, I don't care. I've read your studies. They're not conclusive. Build the cooling towers. So they did have to build the cooling towers, and I was 24.
Right.
So that makes, it feels like, here I am up against the largest corporation in Carolina Power and Light, and they're having to listen to me. It sort of helped me think about, power issues and, personal power issues.
Exactly. So but your agent, but the beautiful thing is that your agency, you realize the power of the individual voice who uses democracies, who understands power and how our democracy works, right? We elect officials who write laws and write regulations, which are called rules of the game. And we now know why people don't make money to these elected officials, because they want to write the rules the way they want to. But if people without the money can help write their own rules, they can actually lobby and try to get them. And so 1972 was a very powerful, as I say, formative year in which, you actually are stepping in and tapping into your power. How does that feed into your environmental justice work as the 1980s roll around?
Yeah. So what happened? I moved from Wilmington. I made a stop in Dothan, Alabama.
Okay.
Which is out in the middle of no place. In the Mobile. And when I was in Mobile, I was working on environmental issues. We stopped them from taking hazardous waste, putting it on a ship, and then going out in the Gulf of Mexico and burning it. And they said, it's all good. No emissions. We'll come back on land. We knew what they were going to do. They were going to load it in a ship and just dump it in the Gulf.
Right.
We're not dumb. So we were able to organize the community and found out that the land that they wanted to dock on was owned by the AFL-CIO.
Okay.
And so we convinced them that it was a good business deal and stopped that. So the ship was called Volcanus, Waste Management. Another,
Volcanus or Bulkanus?
Like a volcano.
Oh, okay. Volcanus. Okay.
Yeah.
Our listeners will probably like, wait a minute.
Yeah. And, Waste Management was the company that wanted to do it. So they're still, bad. So, but while I was living in Mobile, the KKK hung a young African-American man. And that sort of, was a wake-up call for me that this was still going on. Right. Because I had, read about, I'm a history major, so I read about civil rights, got involved in civil rights. Right. But it was still going on. This was 1982.
Okay.
And that's where the Southern Poverty Law Center was formed.
Right.
And they took the case and bankrupted the KKK in Alabama.
Okay.
So, and when I was doing that, I met a gentleman by the name of Pat Bryant.
Okay.
Who you know.
Yes, sir.
Was involved in. And so I moved to Mobile and started working on stuff up in the river. And Pat moved to Mobile and we got together. And he was working, he had the Gulf Coast Tenant Organization, which was a tenants' rights organization, working up and down the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And he called me up one day. He said, Darryl, you know this environmental stuff, right? I said, well, sort of. What we got. So I went, and one of the first fights I got involved with was they had gotten $2 million settlement to re-roof and remodelize a housing project in Taft, Louisiana.
Okay.
So that was a great win. Okay. But the children were getting sick. They were having pink eye. They were having respiratory problems.
Now, geographically, where is Taft, Louisiana, relative to the Mississippi or relative to New Orleans?
Taft is right on the Mississippi, on the West Bank, as we call it in Louisiana, about 40 miles north of New Orleans, along the Mississippi River. So it's up north of it some. And so I started doing research, and there was a Union Carbide plant nearby.
Okay.
And I started looking at what emissions they were having. And if you drove there from the projects to the plant, it took about 15, 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked at the map, it was about 3 air miles, because just the way the river bends and turns and twists and turns the Mississippi River. So they were really next door to this plant,
Right.
but didn't realize it because they had to drive so long. That's one thing about environmental risk. Your mind plays tricks with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's closer than you think,
Right.
especially with the Mississippi River. So we are involved in fighting that, and unfortunately, we didn't win. Union Carbide, we weren't able to get them to control emissions, but that was my first environmental justice fight in Louisiana. And
Well,
we'll stop there.
I want you to
Hold
hold
that
that thought right there, because we got to get a commercial in, and we will pick it right up at the top of the half. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, our man on the boards, Mike Ryan, and our guest today, Darryl Malek-Wiley. Not only is they say he is a EJ pioneer, but he is also an organizer with the Sierra Club, which is one of the nation's oldest and largest environmental organizations. And they put the green in green. And when you think about your U.S. Forest Service and our national park system, it was the pioneers, the Sierra Club, that helped organize and pull together early on to protect these wilderness spaces and treasures that we now take for granted. You know, these are the backbone that created, or as I say, the DNA protoplasm that created our National Forest Service, Park Service. All these things emanated from a lot of grassroots volunteers, beginning with the pioneer John Muir. But specifically, Darryl is also a pioneer in his own right in a movement that now is global and international, that lifts up the voices of frontline communities and people that are, as I say, facing the powerful and who oftentimes pollute the air, water, and soil in the very communities in which these communities live, causing death and destruction and mayhem. And people like Darryl step up into the breach. And it was in the breach, amongst a number of fights that I met Darryl. But we're right now talking about a pioneer within the movement who's having his reminiscence on some part of the journey. You were talking about New Orleans, and you were talking about the Mississippi miles right there,
Right.
And you're realizing that Union Carbide, had already begun a big stink that was poisoning, getting a lot of people sick.
Right. Yeah. And so I worked on that issue, and then there was a company called Freeport-McMoRan that wanted to dump radioactive gypsum into the Mississippi River, which is city of New Orleans drinking water. There was a big fight in '83, and the fight on that's still going on. Here we are in 2003.
Well, the question is that the Mississippi is a freshwater river.
That's correct.
Many municipalities and cities pull their water from a freshwater river.
Yep.
How is it a thing that polluters can dump and discharge in the Mississippi River? Is this where democracy intersects and politicians allow for rules and regulations that allow people to poison the very waters that people need to drink?
Yeah, the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1972, along with the Clean Air Act, a number of major environmental laws under
Richard Nixon.
Richard Nixon. So
it's kind of funny because they would be calling Richard Nixon a commie today. I mean, just for those two acts and laws alone, right? Protecting air and protecting water,
protecting people's health. So companies apply for these permits, and they get permission to poison up to a certain level.
Okay.
And EPA is supposed to study it and figure out how much pollution the Mississippi River can take.
Right. Before it kills somebody or gets somebody sick.
So on the Freeport-McMoRan with the radioactive gypsum, we had our scientists look at the company's own data.
Okay.
And they came up, they said that we're going to discharge this much radioactivity with our gypsum waste. They figured it would increase the leukemia risk in New Orleans by 2 to 3%, which is pretty significant.
Yeah.
When they tested it they're supposed to test it on fish. They had a sentence that said, negative impact on aquatic life.
Really?
Okay, so I went and looked at the document. I read so many documents, and what they said was when they put 90% Mississippi River water
Mm-hmm.
and 10% of the waste, 100% mortality of the fish.
Right.
That's a negative impact on aquatic life.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
we were able to stop that. And when I was doing that, I got a call from I met with a guy by the name of Richard Leonard, who
Okay.
was an organizer with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union.
Okay.
Okay, because they had a lockout from a BASF corporation.
Right.
BASF, large German-based company.
Yeah, this is the one that they make the tapes, and as they say, they make they make all the chemicals that are in the basketball. You know, they ran
That's
that
it.
slick commercial.
That's it. You know,
but back in our day, they were the ones. You know, cassette tapes and 8-track tapes. You know, they were the ones that or a major manufacturer. You could get yourself some BASF tapes.
That's it. That's it. So in labor, you know, the plant was unionized. So when workers are upset, they can go on strike.
Right.
So that people go on strike, people do that all the time. But with the company, what the company did, they said, we don't need your work. We're going to lock the gate and you're locked out.
Right.
They were locked out for 5.5 years, longest labor struggle in the U.S.
Okay.
And so what they were doing, they were looking for innovative ways to put pressure on BASF. So they came to me as an environmentalist, and we worked together on a number of studies looking at pollution. And in one of our strategy meetings with Richard Miller, who was another organizer, and there might have been adult beverages involved. I don't remember, but we
copious libations.
Yes, we decided we were trying to figure out how to frame the issue we're talking about.
Okay.
And so, and in talking with community members, you know, almost everybody in a community knew somebody who had cancer.
Right.
Had relatives. So we decided, well, let's call it Cancer Alley. And that's where the term came from. The union had a member that owned a billboard on Interstate 10. They put a gigantic billboard, "Welcome to Cancer Alley, brought to you by BASF."
Now, what year was that, Darryl?
That was 86, 7, 8. Those sort of 3 years there.
Because the thing is that one of the things that we do in the environmental movement, you know, we come up with terms and points of action, and they become memorable. I mean, they become things that stand out. And as the movement evolves and grows, you know, and one of the reasons why I do this show is to document that history. A lot of folks lay claim that this is what, you know, people don't realize that it was environmental organizers, multi-ethnic environmental organizers, a white brother like yourself, right there with organized labor, doing an analysis as part of a labor action, finding out workers were sick and dying of cancer, but working with labor, coming up with a term that now is even in books. It's you got documentaries, you got law programs, you got public health series, you know. But the reason why capturing this here, brother, because one of the reasons why I had to reach for you is because I knew the story behind Cancer Alley. And I knew where the name came from. And I've had, you know me, because I fight with some of our other brothers and sisters who call themselves the father, etc., of the movement. I says, no, this is where the term came from. And they go, no, we did the first. I go, no, and I'm the first. I go, no, you're the Ben Franklin of the movement, you know. You're the scribe. The father of the movement is an Asian guy by the name of Charles Lee, who actually did the first study. But you know, it's sad, you know, that you have to get into that, but it's because we're not writing the books, and so we got to have other vehicles by which we, like my radio show, which we document the movement in the voices of those who created the action, who created the terms, who pioneered some of the early strategies and struggling work, which now are being studied at universities, law schools, etc. In fact, some of the early pioneering public health disparities work began within the EJ movement, because as you're pointing out, one of the observations that we have is human health reaction to environmental risk and exposure.
Yes.
And that's going to be a common theme and thread. And it sounds like beating a drum, but it's essential to have this conversation. So you guys got the first billboards up, and what's neat about
Right.
the Cancer Alley Point is because that preceded, the toxic waste and race study. I mean, the actual
Right.
use of that
Right.
term, as well as billboards and advertising. You wouldn't have photos of the old billboards, would you?
Someplace I've got it in a book that was written about the whole struggle. So I'll find that and send it to you. I'll make you a picture of it.
You make sure, because I want to get that as part of the montage behind me that you see on the show, because again, it's not only about capturing and documenting and recording the authentic history, but recording it in the voice of the people who actually coined the terms, the actions, and the innovative approaches.
Right.
And a lot of folks don't realize that, you guys were part of, and this was happening all over the country.
Yes.
Environmental activists finding out that people were getting sick, tying it to polluters, but the dots weren't connected. The dots were not connected. And, we got 1 minute, but I want to lead that where the dots do get connected. When did you hear the toxic waste and race study, and what did it mean to you?
It just helped validate all the stuff that we had been saying. And, because we've been saying there was connections about environmental justice. I mean, we hadn't even coined the term environmental justice yet, but about where people were living and what was happening in their communities. And that helped really put some document to what we're saying.
And the other powerful piece of that is that this is 1987, and here you were, you're right here in just approaching, the mid 80s with Cancer Alley and bringing the technology of action and organizing with labor in different groups, different peoples. But the commonality was a depleted and degraded environment under which, you were pulling them together.
Yes.
But listen, we got to get a show. We got to get the commercial in at this moment. And so what I want to do is, tell our listeners, this is going to wrap up the formal part of news, views, and interviews. And we want you to, as I say, stay tuned and catch the other half of news, the entire show of news, views, and interviews on our YouTube channel. Just search for news, views, and interviews. And as they say, and take a walk into the wild side, into the woods, into the natural ecology to get this knowledge. We'll be back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and we're into the overdrive session, the walk on the wild side, into the deep woods, into the deeper conversation on our YouTube channel of news, views, and interviews. Again, our host is Aaron Mayer. Our guest is Darryl Malek-Wiley, organizer of the Sierra Club. Again, more than that, he's a pioneer, founder, and organizer within the environmental justice movement. So I don't want to let the job title cloud the real title that this man, who has been a long time pioneer, activist, and leader and innovator within the environmental justice movement. Not too many people realize that the first movement was called the People of Color Struggle, recognizing that it was poor people of color that were on the front lines dealing with depleted and degraded environments, their health at risk, their life at risk, their children, their families at risk. And it was leaders like my brother Darryl Malek-Wiley and myself and others who stepped out into the breach of this movement that went on to form something that would become the environmental justice movement. And I've known Darryl for decades. We have been on many frontline battles together. But, we're having that conversation. And right now, we're coming off a little bit about what I really want to touch on was the pioneering contribution that he and Pat Bryan did, the labor movement did, with as I say, the coining of the term Cancer Alley as part of an organizing strategy and struggle. And so, how did that wrap up? How did y'all win that fight?
Yes, eventually the BASF hired all the workers back. And so that was a real victory there for the workers. But out of that grew the labor union decided they were going to help us fund. We did the Great Louisiana Toxics March.
Okay.
And we titled it
real quick. Give us again the Toxic Cancer Alley. What was the city, town, and location of that?
Okay, so the BASF plant is in Geismar, Louisiana,
Okay.
which is about 50 miles north of New Orleans, 30 miles south of Baton Rouge.
Okay. And is that also on the Mississippi?
The plant is on the Mississippi. The town's a little bit off the river.
Okay. But their discharges and everything was into the Mississippi,
Right.
like all the other toxic plants.
That's correct. And also the air emissions.
And so between the fluids, meaning the air emissions and the Mississippi, again, people pulling their drinking water, basically watering their crops, on the farms along the Mississippi are coming from that river where, again, another corporation is discharging. We have nuclear. We have right now just basically chemical pollutants. But we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the gas and oil sector that's going to be dumping. But anyway, let's get to that big march.
Right. So we purposely named it the Great Louisiana Toxics March. Mm-hmm. So every time the media reported it, they have to say the Great Louisiana Toxics March.
What year was this?
1988.
Okay.
We 11 days. We marched from a place called Devil Swamp, which is north of Baton Rouge, which mm-hmm. is now a Superfund site because of all the chemical contamination by Exxon, Shell, and Dow. And mm-hmm. it's still a mess. And mm-hmm. we walked through Baton Rouge. We walked all the way from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. We were the #1 news story on every television station, every newspaper. And while we were Pat Bryant and myself were the main organizers of the land walking down the river. Greenpeace had their boat coming down the river.
Okay.
And they were taking water samples. So it was we were hitting them by land and water.
Exactly.
And it was an amazing event. After the event, somebody sent me in a brown paper envelope, a poll that the Industry Association had done showing that we had shifted awareness about chemical pollution by over 48%.
Wow. And this is a year after the publication of the toxic waste and waste study.
Right.
So you already have this thing that's exploded that's saying, that pollution and contamination are the biggest drivers of not only health inequality, but life and mortality. And if you are poor, you're more than likely to get a site. And if you're Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Indigenous, you're triply more likely to get this. And so this study was pioneering in that it linked for the first time what people suspected, that the civil rights movement was just not about equal rights and voting rights. It's about the public policy outcomes that the legislators and the rule makers, when they get into office, why they want to control government so that they can basically pollute, as they say, without a license. And this study comes along and it gives you a data and statistical revolution in your argument. And you're now having the awareness on top of that of this direct action. So at what stage did you hear about a broader organizing effort to pull together the first People of Color Summit?
Yeah, so in 1990, or it might have been early 91, the first People of Color Summit was 91 in the fall. So the steering committee came to New Orleans and we gave them a tour up Cancer Alley.
Okay.
And you have to remember in 91, there were no cell phones. So all the steering committee had to sit on a bus. It took 12 hours from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, stopping, talking with folks, smelling what they live with. And I heard from a number of the steering committee members that really gelled their thinking about environmental justice.
Right.
That it helped the committee come together in ways they didn't expect because they had to be with each other, talking with each other without interruption for 12 hours while experiencing what people live with 365 days a year. So a number of people came back and said that was the thing that really helped them define what they wanted to talk about in the People of Color Summit in 91.
Exactly.
And so,
go ahead.
Yeah. And when I went there, I went and the Sierra Club president at that time was Michael Fisher,
Okay.
and he talked, and he said, "Well, if you don't like what the Sierra Club's doing, take it over. Join the." That's what he.
So that was
And
the first declarative statement to the EJ movement, saying, "Listen, hijack it."
yeah, that's it. That's it.
All
So
right.
it was great, and see, at the same time, all this stuff was going on. We had the Sierra Club Gulf Coast Regional Conservation Committee,
Okay.
which was Sierra Club leaders from Louisiana all the way to Florida, talking about environmental justice fights in each state
Right.
and sort of cross-pollinating. So we did joint marches. We worked with the Charlotte Keys with Jesus People Against Pollution,
Yeah.
where their community was contaminated with creosote plant.
In fact, she's going to be on here next month.
Oh, great! Yeah.
So we got to have the upper part of Mississippi, but Sister Charlotte Keys, and what's real beautiful about you and Charlotte and myself and others, because a lot of people think that it's only a handful of people because of a few books, but they don't realize there was a massive amount of us in the room when the first summit went down, and unfortunately, because of publication, not because of fact, a lot of us ended out on the cutting floor. A lot of movements, a lot of people. Remember Connie Tucker?
Yep.
Yes. Connie was a firebrand. I mean, she and I butt heads because we had this broader movement, which was everybody, but Connie Tucker just wanted to make it only SOC and just only wanted to make it a black movement. And people don't realize that we were having this fight even within the movement that said, no, it's the big umbrella. No, we have to come together. We can't be narrow, and this is where the lines are. But we had the data and that analysis and that movement. Your quick highlights and reflections from the first People of Color Summit of yours.
It was just amazing. There were just so many people there, and coming together and really having meaningful discussions I had more informational conversations in the halls than I did listen to the speakers. You know exactly. How that goes.
Well, that's where I met Tom Goldtooth before there was an Indigenous Environmental Justice Network. People don't realize a lot of things that people are saying. Well, this was. I go, no, that was. By the time the second People of Color Summit, Tom had formed the IEN. Right. But before that, Tom and his people, and as I said, the Zuni Nation, the Sioux, a lot of the First Nations, but I remember Tom just, speaking and spitting fire then.
Yes. And so it was also, lots of people talking about it. Really the same thing we're talking about now. It's a diversity.
Exactly.
It's not just Black. It's Hispanic. It's Native American. It's poor whites. It's, Asian, Vietnamese, all sorts of communities that are impacted by this. And I think that was the main thing that I got from being there. I had already been working by that time with the Vietnamese community in New Orleans East over a fight over landfills. So I was already branching out myself to other communities in Louisiana.
But you were already walking the walk and talk, brother, before the as I said, what I call the coalescing session of the first People of Color Summit, which basically put into movement and organizing action what the toxic race and race study. Right. And it was that seminal point that was really critical to that. And I just think that, getting these fine points documented has been really, really critical. Listen, brother, I appreciate you. We got to get this commercial in here. And we're going to be going into the last segment. So we're going to try to do a quick, what I call the lightning round on the Sierra Club, and then we'll close it off there. Our guest, Darryl Malek-Wiley, organizer, preeminence, for the Sierra Club, but environmental justice founder and pioneer. You hear what I'm saying? Environmental justice founder and pioneer amongst the number of brothers and sisters that are within the movement. And so in seeing his image and hearing his voice, you're getting that deep knowledge and deep history, untold history of the EJ movement. We'll be right back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. We're having that overdrive walk into the forest of deep knowledge, of experience, and history and legacy of what is the environmental justice movement. And you're hearing it here again. Well, this is one of those chances that we bring the movement alive. You know, I'm not a big writer, but my medium is the conversation. And Darryl, Malek-Wiley, and I, and others who are founders, go all the way back to the rooms where things have happened. And you know, again, we're dealing in that deep knowledge. And you know, not only did you and Pat Bryant come up with Cancer Alley, it took a lot of those who would later at the People of Color Summit formulate, you know, as I say, broad event, EJ movement strategies, tactics, and language and nomenclature. But you took them on what I call one of the earlier toxic tours, even though many of them come from contaminated communities. But you put bone the flesh of Charles Lee's study by direct actions and getting everybody to see it, experience, as they say, smell it, you know. But
Right.
the other thing that you guys created was the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. When was the Deep South Center of Environmental Justice formed? Where was it born? In whose living room? Was it yours or was it Pat Bryant's?
No, it was at University of New Orleans with a professor I know, Dr. Shirley Laska, who, and she had some money.
Okay.
So we pulled together a planning committee. Pat Bryant and myself were the key people on there, and we interviewed a number of people to be the executive director for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice.
Okay.
Dorothea Taylor.
Okay.
And
Yes.
Dr. Beverly
Sister
Wright.
Dorothea.
Yes, Sister Dorothea,
Okay.
Dr. Beverly Wright, and others. And so it was first originally based at Xavier University in New Orleans.
Right.
Then moved to Dillard University, and it's now independent.
Well, you know, what's amazing about it, you know, because everybody talks about an origin story. And I always tell people, if you really know the history, if you really were in the room when it happens, you know, then you know. I never pretended to call myself the father of EJ. You know, I was a Revolutionary War fighter in the movement. And so I always tell people, I go, if I'm going to call myself a character, it'll be the Alexander Hamilton of the movement, because I'm a Federalist. I believe in formally linking grassroots people of color organizations with the mainstream environmental movement, which we're going to go to in a second, because I felt that was an essential strategy to get the resources and financing. It's not enough of rhetoric and who's got the ugliest scar and sores or who's got the most cancer. It's about financing and funding the movement. But the other place is that, you know, the institutions and the institutes. And I think that I'm happy that for the first time people are hearing on this show that, you know, it was, you know, a multi-ethnic brotherhood formed in the struggle of labor rights, environmental justice, that formed one of the critical institutions, the Deep South Center of Environmental Justice. Now, granted, you guys were there, but your name is not etched into the foundational record. And I'm just glad that we have an opportunity to correct that record here. As I say, attitudes be damned, but once we launch this on the internet, you know, like I said, you know, I stand on my work and my life's work in dedication to the environmental justice movement, as you stand on yours, my brother. And we do this in solidarity. All the more reason why, we want folks to know that deep history, that untold history you're not going to find in most books, but actually lived, okay, and fought for by brothers and sisters in the movement like you and I, who are still living and still tell tales. As you know, you and I definitely butted head with Sister Connie Tucker, but she is not with us. But I can say she was a righteous woman, you know, and one of the most powerful, fearful organizers. And I always tell people, when we went into national battles, it was always beautiful having her by my side, because when she went off, brother, she was like that Claymore mine, brother. she took out what was ever in front of her.
Yes, she would.
God rest her soul. But I mean, it's important that this history is recorded and that we did to talk about it, because one of the things that you know, we did do and that you were part of was that we got this EJ movement, you know, within the Sierra Club. We started as a committee, and then, you know, we got this big. I can't remember the guy, the multimillionaire who gave us the first big EJ money to the Sierra Club.
Yeah, I never knew the man, so
Well, anyway, we'll leave that for another show.
yeah,
But the point of the matter is, it gave us money to hire actually institutionalized staff within the Sierra Club and
yes.
hire an executive director. We hired John McCown. Am I correct?
Yeah, John McCown was the first person that worked full time. Jim Price, who was then the regional staff in Alabama, was very supportive. And
Leslie Fields over in Texas.
yes, Leslie Fields was working in Texas in the Texas staff, the Sierra Club. And then we had now Bill Price,
Yeah.
who was working in West Virginia, Rhonda Anderson in Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
Irv Sheffy, who's in DC. We had Robert Tohey, who unfortunately Brother Robert's passed.
Mm-hmm.
Navajo working in New Mexico and Arizona. Rita Harris, who's
Mm-hmm.
now on the National Board of Sierra Club. Myself, I was hired in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And there are others that we had a number of staff people, and then Leslie became the leader of the whole environmental justice program within the Sierra Club.
And what was really beautiful, I liked about it, because not only because at that time there was a big conflict with the Sierra Club and the EJ movement that I often found myself in the middle of, and the fight was that, well, the white people are taking over. I go, well, that's not true. They're building capacity. They have the institutional, the capacity to help amplify the movement. And yes, and we had to have a conversation with them about making space for diverse communities of color too. So there was two sides of this fight. There was the fight within the Sierra Club, but there was also the fight on the outside that I had to deal with in the EJ movement. And I actually, as you know, my origin story, because the Sierra Club, did not want to back us in our fight against the Answers incinerator, the solid waste incinerator in the capital of the state of New York. In fact, told us to go to the NAACP. But still I would come back, become a group chair, a chapter chair within the organization, and ultimately through my national work help lay the foundational I would say to build a bridge, you got people working on both sides of it. And that's one of the areas where you and I met. You're working on one side. I go, damn, man, this is thankless Chas, brother. We're getting clobbered on all sides, man. I was being called Uncle Tom, but I did not get it as bad as John McCown did. They were really, he was the first, as I said, when you're the first one to cross a bridge, you get mowed down.
Yes,
and they mowed him down. Connie was merciless on her. I would have to pull her aside and say, listen, sister, you can't do that, And it was that mistrust, because as you break down the walls of racism and you start to see these connections, it really releases a lot of pain.
Yes.
And it's not that it's not that they hated people. It just became another dam that broke. And a lot of stuff that needed to be spilled out did get spilled out. But the other piece is that brothers like you and I had to try to come back with the healing salve, brother, to try to heal some of the wounds and some of that pain, and here we still are, bro.
Yep. Still going.
This is, we've done countless toxic tours from the capital, Albany, New York, down to the coal fields of Pennsylvania, the mountaintop removal of West Virginia, everywhere in between, Peabody coal plant. Oh man, you name it. You and I pretty much, as part of the club, really pushed the envelope. And the thing is, where we are today is that a lot of the EJ movement now is getting access to those same funders, and we've crossed that Rubicon where now everybody sees these movements coming together. I mean, there's still some ruffles and tensions, but now they're pretty much in the same room. But the question now is having that conversation about how do you go forward and build more power, because now we're really starting to see and having a deeper conversation of when I became president on our democracy movement, which then takes it to the higher level of saying that all of these outcomes of pollution and toxic, it's a function of who we elect as political leaders. And Citizens United, is the thing that is basically giving them undue influence. And this is where we need, to push back, to take back our democracy. And that is still true, but we still have, as they say, the healing and the other work to still keep it, people covered. We had the second People of Color Summit. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And because I had to, at that time, we actually had a table, and they didn't want the Sierra Club in the room. And I actually moved the Sierra Club not only at my table was in the center of the room. And, I had Carl Pope. He was like, what's going on? We giving money. We don't. I go, dude, this is not about how much money. He goes, but Greenpeace is in the room. I said, well, listen, man, that's why I'm bringing you to the front of the room and sitting you at the table, because the movement cannot take money from Greenpeace, EDF, and all the NRDC, and then all these white groups are what I call big groups who have no inclusion and equity. They get an easy pass because they wrote big checks. But the group that had grassroots people on the ground and big movement was getting shat upon. And I actually, we had that moment in the middle of the room was me, Phaedra Prezullo, Kristen Rapago, Carl Pope, Bob Bingaman. Some of the staff did not want to come over near us, but my then ex-wife stood up and spoke in Spanish. And that was the intervention whereby, because they even forgot to get translators in the damn room. So they had up on the stage Bob, Beverly, Peggy, Bernice. I'm trying to call. There was a Hispanic sister that was up there with them, but it wasn't diversified up on the stage. And when they caught that contradiction, that intervention, man, brought the house down. And it called also a very critical moment about, are we a people of color movement, or what's going on here, and I just think that it was a powerful breakthrough. And it was at that meeting that I really formally threw in my weight with the Sierra Club and the work that, that everybody that was involved, because that's where you were, that's where Leslie Fields, Rita Harris. So there was already this diverse coalition of people there. And we really cared about the action and the movement and the people. We didn't get caught up into what I call the politics of that was happening, and that, that often can damage and injure and kill a movement before it gets started. So people don't realize how the movement could have actually spun apart at the second People of Color Summit. And what's really sad and tragic is we haven't had another one since then. Did you notice that?
Yes.
That was the real big tragedy. But man, we covered a lot of ground, brother. We covered a lot of ground. But what a lot of people don't want to also give credit to the EJ movement back in 2002, and I believe it was in Bali. And that was where a lot of the early serious environmental talk on climate began. Remember Tom Goldtooth issuing his points on, commodifying air and commodifying water, and that you can't corporatize these things. And this was before any mainstream environmental organization started walking and talking in the environmental space.
Yes.
And again, pioneering ground that the Sierra Club, really cut into the space. This is, again, brother, this is, as they say, a opportunity and a joy to have this conversation with you, because we're going to get ready to go and talk about, Hurricane Katrina and the shock doctrine. And this is that what I call the alternate effects of the great impacts of climate change in frontline communities being at, as they say, at greater risk. And you, again, brother, down in New Orleans, I don't know what it is with New Orleans cutting through the first, but you literally were underwater.
Yeah. The levees broke in a number of places. And so for the Hurricane Katrina, I I evacuated over to Houston because I heard the storm was coming, and that was the time when the Sierra Club was doing the Sierra Club Summit. You remember that in
Oh yeah.
San Francisco?
Oh yeah.
So I got my plane ticket changed, and once I got to headquarters, they put me in a room with phone line, and said, "Talk to all these reporters." So they had lined up reporters that I was doing interviews nonstop, talking
Mhm.
about the environmental justice impact of Hurricane Katrina. Then they were going to give me some time on the stage to talk to the whole out. Before I was able to go on the stage, Carl Pope asked me and Rhonda Anderson and some others to come and talk with him. And he said, "Darryl, you shouldn't talk about environmental racism, environmental justice on the stage." And I said, "Okay." I went on the stage and talked about the environmental racism in Katrina. And, once you get me on the mic, watch out.
We were in the room when it happened. We can tell you about the days and places, as I say, where all the misplaced cups went. You were dropping a piece of heavy knowledge because, as I say, Sierra Club is dealing with so-called reckoning with racism. But there was a time where you couldn't even say the word racism, and not only just in the Sierra Club, but even at the
Right.
founding of the movement. Because Dr. Ben Chavis, who at that time was from the United Church of Christ, he then gone on to later, one of his rises from that was to become president of the NAACP. But at the point where we were fighting for environmental justice law, which would have ultimately become the Environmental Justice Executive Order under President Bill Clinton, the term, a lot of people bristled when you said environmental race, they've shut down. And I will have the sister on as well, who actually coined the term, an African-American woman, a communications entrepreneur, who coined the term environmental justice. And it's, people don't realize that, how terms come about, when and where, but these are critical pieces that people just take for granted,
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
people,
because
go ahead.
yeah, let me say a couple of things because I know what EPA, when they were first trying to deal with this, they were talking about environmental equity.
Right.
That means we all get polluted equally. That's not what we
Right.
want.
Exactly.
We want justice.
Exactly. And that's the thing that's kind of mind blowing. And that, it's not about equity, it's about justice. And
Yes.
how do we get that in the equal treatment and equal protection under the law? But more importantly, the movement brought the notion, and getting the notion of environmental is clean air, clean water, and clean soil a human right. And this is the thing, while linking it to the civil rights, made it very powerful. And that's when corporations, really the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other entities, started reacting incredibly in the space of getting Republicans to go after environmental justice law. We, to this day, we're still fighting over,
Yes.
where the period and lines are dotted. But right now, under Biden, we're seeing, billions with a B for the first time ever for frontline communities and environmental justice spaces. I mean, did you think you ever see a day where billions of dollars were set aside?
No, never. Because we've been, dealing with pennies and nickels forever.
Well, listen, you went through what in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, after the levees broke and the separate
Right.
unequal treatment of people of color, and watching people die.
Yes. Yes.
And there were even white supremacists on bridges making sure blacks didn't cross over into their communities, even though they're
Yes.
trying to survive being drowned. But President Bush did something called the shock doctrine. This was the first time that they ever used federal social planning policy to tear down civil society institutions to
Yes.
impose an agenda. So, can you talk about the teachers union, the schools that were shut down,
Right.
what that meant, and then the imposition of charter schools after they busted the union in New Orleans? It was about, in fact, it was that decimation that gave them the opportunity to elect, granted, a person of color governor, but a Republican. And had the population been, had there been no Hurricane Katrina, you would have never had a Bobby Jindal.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about the shock doctrine.
Yeah. So after Katrina, they did a number of things. One, they changed public policy on housing projects. They
Hmm.
tore down all the housing projects in New Orleans. They went back with Section 8, units where the housing projects that were there were structurally sound and could have been renovated to a much better uh, living standard than the stuff they replaced them with.
But it
So
was
that
about
was one step.
depopulation. Look, Darryl, it was about depopulation,
It was
right?
about taking the people in the housing projects, Black African Americans, and making sure they didn't have a place to come back to.
Exactly. And because at the end of the day, if you got an area that had 80% African American and you can now reduce it down to 10 to 20% African American, and the thousands of votes that used to be there, okay,
Yes.
and you're coming up on the census, you get to not only steal a congressional seat, a whole host of political. It's about power, right? Was not the shock doctrine
Yeah.
not only about rejiggering civil society and imposing a right-wing public policy agenda, but it was about depopulation. It was like Blazing Saddles, right? To destroy the
Yes.
town of Rockridge, no?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it was. And with the teachers union, since they shut down, all the schools were damaged, and they came up with this idea of going to charter schools, which is basically taking public wealth and giving it to private corporations.
And
And
they
they're
didn't have to hire
skimming off
unions,
all the
right?
money.
They busted the teachers union,
Bust the
basically.
union too. Yeah.
Right.
They busted the teacher union. Here we are 18 years after Katrina, and some of the charter schools are now getting unionized again. So that's coming back. But the whole idea of going to charter schools was, in my opinion, stupid. We should have rebuilt the schools we had and kept it as a New Orleans public school system. But it was just the right wing agenda that we want to have charter schools so our friends can take all this public money and put it in their pockets. And that's what they did.
One of the things that you and I were there on the, was it the 10th? It was the 10th.
10th anniversary, right?
I hate to call it an anniversary because it was
Yeah,
really
I
a
know.
sad event, But
Yes.
you and I were there. We marched and we had fellowship, and the point was is that the communities were broken. I mean, it's
Right.
and I tell people that they're that you saw a harbinger at that point in time was what was going to become the public policy of America. And under Trump, you're pretty much seeing them, the anti-democracy efforts now, experiments that they learned from public policy outcomes, again, using climate, because people don't realize this was a public policy bonanza that occurred in the wake of a climate crisis, in which they then leveraged that crisis to deal with right-wing politics, anti-Black politics, anti-union politics, anti-labor politics, anti-poverty politics. They used that climate crisis and its outcomes and most severe effects not to lift up a community, but to tear down. And now they're going back to that playbook that we're seeing in other states. With that same, tactic that as I say, they gain success because now a lot of the reapportionment stuff that they're doing comes from the fact that people, have learned that you can absolutely, like in the case of New Orleans, take a state and take an area that was once heavily Democratic and progressive and, and inclusive with its public policy and reverse them 50 years. You can absolutely shave 50 years and go in the opposite direction, And again, the EJ movement, the climate movement, these pieces are critical. What are you looking at when they say make it right and next steps? How do we go forward?
Right. Yeah. So I worked for 10 years in the lower Ninth Ward, which was the most heavily impacted area. And we worked on trying to make the community more survivable, more resilient, more independent in energy usage. So we had to change public policy because the houses in lower Ninth Ward, like much of New Orleans, were built in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and they didn't have solar panels then.
Right.
So it's the historic district. They said, you can't put solar panels in. We said, well, what? Well, we forced them to change that law.
Good.
And so got a number of solar panels installed in the lower Ninth Ward. We were working to set up a microgrid, but we never could find the financial money to do that. So, some of the policies that we were doing right after Hurricane Katrina were on the cutting edge and are still on the cutting edge as far as survivability for communities.
Well,
And it needs to happen all over the country.
I'm going to be having Dr. Michael Dorsey, and he is absolutely he's created a consortium to deal with microgrids. So I'm going to definitely make sure after we do that show that we connect them with you and your efforts.
Right.
Listen, my brother, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And as I say, laying down some tracks. And this was what I call a real power hour. But I think it's important that this is in the record for the collective consumption of all those who want to really seriously dig into the EJ movement, for those lost stories, those forgotten stories, but very defining stories that really were critical parts of the infrastructure of what became the national and international environmental justice movement. Brother Darryl Malek-Wiley, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aaron.